against each other to win one woman's heart, Americans watched another show about random strangers competing for a mate. It was called The Dating Game. Starting in 1965, this reality show featured a woman asking 3 men questions without seeing their faces, and based on their answers, at the end of the show, she would choose one to go on a date with. On the surface, the September 13th, 1978 showing of The Dating Game looks like every other episode with lots of unsubtle innuendo, but this episode would go down in history as a one-of-a-kind, and not in a good way. At the end of this particular show, it was time for the Bachelorette, Cheryl Bradshaw, to make her decision, and she would choose Bachelor number 1, who would turn out to be this tall, good-looking, long-haired guy whose name was Rodney. Rodney comes around the partition and they see each other for the first time and everybody laughs and they hug, and the show looks like every other show, and on stage, Rodney looks like every other contestant that's ever been on the show. But after the show ended and Cheryl and Rodney went backstage and actually began having a real conversation that was not being filmed, Cheryl would say that Rodney completely changed. He became incredibly creepy and was saying things like, "I always get the girl." And then at some point he says, "Hey, you should come out with me tonight. It'll be a date you'll never forget." And she turns to him and just says, "No thanks." This would turn out to be a really wise decision because Rodney was a horrible, horrible person. Had the show done a background check on Rodney, they would have discovered that he assaulted an 8-year-old and went to jail for 3 years for it and was currently on parole. But even if they had done a background check on Rodney, the check would not have discovered what he did at night. Rodney was shamelessly cocky and self-confident, and unlike a lot of men, he had no issue walking right up to any woman anywhere and flirting with her. And he used that to his advantage. He would go up to women in bars and he would convince them that he was a fashion photographer and that they were so beautiful, would you come back to my apartment and do a photo shoot with me? And just like Cheryl on the dating show, these women were immediately kind of charmed by him and would say yes. Once they got back to his apartment, he would shut and lock the door and then become that creepy guy that Cheryl saw backstage. But unlike Cheryl, who at the time she saw this just said, "I'm not interested," and was able to leave, these women were trapped, and then whether they wanted to or not, they would do a photo shoot with him and then he would strangle them to death. Because Rodney Alcala was not your typical dating game contestant. He was a serial killer who, by the time he stepped foot on that show and was chosen by Cheryl Bradford to win the game, he had already killed 4 people. And over a 2-year period, he killed as many as 130 people, which, if you're doing the math, is over those 2 years, he was killing at least 1 person a week. Alcala was finally apprehended and he was sentenced to death. Here are some highlights from Rodney Alcala's episode of The Dating Game.
And we're going to start by having them say hello to you and see how they sound. Number 1, would you say hello to Cheryl, please?
We're going to have a great time together, Cheryl.
Okay, and here we go.
Bachelor number 1.
Yes?
What's your best time?
The best time is at night, nighttime,
Why do you say that?
because that's the only time there is.
The only time? What's wrong with morning, afternoon?
Well, they're okay, but nighttime's when it really gets good.
Bachelor number 1. I am serving you for dinner.
Oh,
What are you called and what do you look like?
I'm called the banana, and I look really good.
Can you be a little more descriptive?
Peel me.
I'm going to ask you a question. Will that date be Bachelor number 1, Bachelor number 2, or Bachelor number 3? Who gets the dates?
Well, I like bananas, so I'll take 1.
Number 1, Bachelor number 1, all right. He's a skydiver, so he's got a lot of nerve. He's into motorcycling. He's also a fine photographer. Say hello to Rodney Alcala. Rodney, come on and say hello. Congratulations, Rod. You did it with a 1 answer.
Abigail Williams was over her best friend Liberty German's house for a sleepover. Abby and Libby were 13 and 14 respectively. That night, as they're laying in bed, they were looking out the window hoping they saw snowflakes come down because there was apparently this huge storm that was going to roll through the next day, and they were hoping that if it did, school would be canceled the next day. But when they woke up the next morning, it hadn't even snowed. However, they found out that in Delphi, Indiana, where they lived, school had been canceled preemptively in anticipation of this big storm that never really amounted to anything. So the girls got a free day off where they could actually go outside and enjoy it. So the girls start talking about how they're going to spend their extra day off, and Libby suggests, well, why don't we go check out the Monon High Bridge? It was this abandoned bridge that crossed over the stream, and a lot of their classmates would take pictures on it and post it to their social media, and the girls figured this is a great day to go do that. So Libby asks her grandmother, Becky, who was her primary caretaker, if it would be okay if they went for a hike over near this bridge. Becky gives them permission, but with the caveat that they would find their own ride there and back. So Libby convinces her older sister, Kelsey, to give them a ride there, and Libby speaks to her father, Derek, and he says he can pick them up, but he'd only be able to pick them up at a very specific time, which would only give the girls a couple of hours at the bridge, but they thought that was fine and that was plenty of time. So a couple hours later, at about 1:30 in the afternoon, Kelsey drops off the two girls at the start of the trail that's going to bring them to this bridge. We know the girls made it to the bridge because at 2:07 p.m., Libby posted a picture to her social media of Abby walking across the bridge. At 3:11 p.m., Libby's father, Derek, texted her and said, hey, I'm going to be there in a minute. Just want to make sure you guys are there to meet me. And she didn't text Derek back, and Derek would later say that that was pretty unusual for her. At 3:14 p.m., Derek arrives at the meeting spot, and the girls are nowhere to be found. And so Derek tries calling. There's no answer. He texts his daughter, no response. And so he ends up calling Becky, Libby's grandmother, his mother, and says, hey, did the girls contact you and change plans about where I was picking them up or when? And Becky said, no, I haven't heard from them. They said they'd be there at 3. They should be there now. I haven't heard from them. And Derek says he can't get in touch with them. So for the next 10 minutes, Becky and her husband, Mike, Libby's grandfather, just try calling over and over and over again to the girls, but nothing's going through. They can't get them to respond to text messages. So Mike leaves and meets up with Derek in the parking lot, and the two of them begin walking the trail to try to find these girls. At this point, the family's not suspecting foul play. They're thinking, the girls probably got lost, or they lost track of time, or their phones just ran out of batteries, or maybe they did get hurt and they can't move, but it's probably not that serious. They're creating scenarios in their head to rationalize what's happening. But by the time the sun went down at about 5 p.m. and there was still no sign of these girls, they ended up calling the police and officially reporting the girls missing. By 6 p.m. that night, there is this massive search combing the trail looking for these girls, but all night they're looking everywhere with hundreds of searchers and there's no sign of them. The following day, on Tuesday, February 14th, one of the searchers was about a half mile away from the bridge where the girls have been taking those pictures, and they discovered the girls' bodies right next to a creek. The police didn't release their cause of death. However, they said without a doubt this is a homicide, because apparently the scene was incredibly disturbing and had at least 2 or 3 signatures. Signatures are things done to the victims that are above and beyond what is required to end their life. Things like writing on the victims or their body position, or much, much worse. And usually you only see signatures when you're dealing with a serial killer. 3 days after the bodies were discovered, police were able to extract some video from Libby's phone. It turns out when Libby was taking those pictures of Abby on the bridge and had just posted it to social media, apparently this guy had come on the bridge and Libby must have sensed danger and she began filming him. Now, there is apparently a video that starts from the bridge and lasts all the way through the girls' final moments, but the police would release a very small snippet of this recording because it showed who they believe is the killer walking towards them with his hands in his pockets looking down, and he says to them, guys, down the hill.
Guys, down the hill. Guys, down the hill.
Despite thousands of tips pouring in as soon as this video was made public, they still don't know who this guy is, no arrests have been made, and the case remains unsolved. Of the tiny farming community, Fairdale, Illinois, woke up to heavy rains outside and an ominous forecast. Severe thunderstorms were going to persist all day, and then at night there was a chance of a tornado. Meteorologists were telling residents of Fairdale that if you can, you should evacuate because it's not worth sticking around for. But if you're going to ride out the storm, make sure you've taken the necessary precautions and make sure you have a plan for how to get to a shelter if the storm gets really bad. That morning, some forecasters were saying this tornado could prove to be one of the biggest in Illinois' history. But most of the 152 Fairdale residents had lived here their whole lives, and they'd seen bad storms before, even tornadoes, and they had ridden them out before. How could this one be any different? You know, most of the time, the worst that happened was maybe a power line comes down and you lose power for the day. But unlike previous storms, this one was getting worse and worse by the minute, and by 6 p.m. that night, forecasters were no longer theorizing that this could be a huge tornado. They were outright pleading with Fairdale residents to evacuate while you still can. But despite these warnings, the vast majority of Fairdale residents stayed put. They were committed to riding the storm out. By 7 p.m., meteorologists were saying this tornado is imminent and it looks as big or bigger than the last major tornado that came through Illinois that killed 8 people and leveled an entire town. This tornado tonight is going to kill people. Just 15 minutes later at 7:15, the tornado finally touched down right outside of Fairdale. It was this massive, almost mile-wide tornado with over 200-mile-an-hour winds, and unlike other tornadoes of that size that typically move at about 30 miles an hour, this one was traveling on land at about 15 miles an hour, meaning it would be sitting over the areas. It was devastating for longer amounts of time, making it even worse than some of the worst predictions that meteorologists had for this tornado. 15 minutes later at 7:30 p.m., 84-year-old Fairdale resident Clem Schultz and his wife Jerry Schultz, they were at home because they had decided to ride out the storm. As Clem is sitting in the living room watching the Weather Channel, kind of waiting for the last possible second to go into their basement, he hears his wife yell out from the kitchen to come in here and look at this. So Clem goes into the kitchen and she's pointing out the back window, and he looks out and he sees this massive tornado coming right at them. It's less than a mile away and it is way bigger than he thought it was going to be. But from their perspective, because the tornado was spinning counterclockwise, it kind of looked like it was spinning away from town into this empty field. And Clem says to his wife Jerry, you know what, it looks like it's going to miss us, but we're probably going to lose power, so I'm going to go up into the attic and get some lanterns ready. So Jerry stays in the kitchen, Clem goes up into the attic, and as he's fishing to get out the lanterns, he hears what sounds like a freight train barreling through town, and he had this little window at the edge of his attic, so he goes over and he looks out, and the tornado had not veered off into the open field. It had continued straight towards his house, and it was ripping off roofs right in front of him. And he figured, I don't have enough time to go down into the basement. I have no time to do anything. So he takes out his phone and he begins recording. Clem's house, along with all the others in that video, collapsed. And initially, Clem thought he had died because it went totally quiet and it was totally dark. And he actually said out loud, "Am I dead?" But it was the pain in his back from a crushed vertebrae that told him, no, you survived. And he begins to kind of pull himself out of the rubble, and before long, a neighbor is pulling him out. And as soon as he's out of the rubble of his house, he looks around and his whole community is pretty much gone. And as he's standing there kind of bewildered, his neighbor says, "Clem, don't look down." And Clem says, "Why?" And his neighbor says, "Because your wife is under you and she's dead." When the dust had finally settled, not only had Clem's wife been killed, but Clem's neighbor had been killed as well, because the tornado went directly through their two houses. That video that Clem shot is now used to educate people on how dangerous tornadoes really are, and how anytime a tornado is coming through your area, never go outside to film it. She was having renovations done to her home in St. Petersburg, Russia. A friend of hers, 79-year-old Valentina Ulanova, had heard about Tamara's renovations, and she approached her and said, "Do you want to stay with me while that's getting done?" Tamara was very thankful, immediately said yes, and as soon as she moved in, she immediately started picking up the slack by cleaning up the house and doing the dishes, and made sure she always cooked food for her friend because she wasn't able to pay rent. After a couple of weeks, the renovations on Tamara's home were complete, but Tamara didn't want to leave. She was really enjoying living with Valentina, and so she asked Valentina would it be okay if she stayed a little bit longer. Valentina was a little bit reluctant, but did ultimately say, okay, that's fine. A couple of months go by, and Tamara is showing no sign that she plans on leaving Valentina's home anytime soon, and Valentina is getting increasingly frustrated with that reality. Finally, in late July 2015, Valentina confronts Tamara and says, "You gotta go." And Tamara just says, "No, I'm not leaving." This causes a huge fight, but at the end of it, Tamara still doesn't leave. So for a couple of days, the women just do not speak to each other. The silence is finally broken on July 23rd when the women get into a fight about some empty cups in the sink that one of them was supposed to clean, but they didn't, and they fought about whose responsibility it was to do the dishes. And then of course the whole subject comes up again of Valentina saying, "You shouldn't even be here, you need to leave," and Tamara's like, "No, I'm not gonna leave," and so another big blowout fight happens. But at the end of this fight, Tamara finally concedes and says, "Okay, I get it. I need to leave, just give me a couple of days and I'll be out of your hair." Immediately, the tension is gone in the room, they're no longer fighting, and Valentina is happy that she's finally gonna get her apartment back, and Tamara says, "Look, I'll make us dinner tonight, I'll go out and get some food." Tamara leaves the apartment and goes to a pharmacy and gets a whole bunch of sleeping pills, and then she gets the ingredients to a particular salad that she knows Valentina really likes. She goes back, she starts making dinner, and as she's making this salad, she crushes up the sleeping pills and mixes the powder with the salad dressing and gives that to Valentina. And Valentina, who's very hungry, eats the whole salad and doesn't notice anything is wrong. As soon as Tamara was sure Valentina had eaten the entire salad, Tamara just goes up to her room and goes to bed. A couple hours later, at about 2 a.m, she goes back down to the kitchen and she sees Valentina is passed out on the ground. Tamara goes up to her and sees that she's still breathing, which was a disappointment because she wanted her to die from taking all these sleeping pills. But it doesn't matter. She takes out her hacksaw that she had borrowed from the neighbor earlier in the day and proceeds to butcher Valentina. And she makes special care as she's cutting her into pieces to remove her lungs and not damage them, because Tamara had a taste for human lungs. It was actually her favorite food. She took Valentina's head and she put it into a big pot of water and began boiling that to eat it. The rest of her was cut up into as small of pieces as she could get them, and then wrapped in a shower curtain and placed in various bags. As Valentina's head and lungs are being cooked on the stovetop, Tamara begins making dozens of trips from the apartment, down the stairs, out the front door, all the way down to the lake that was near their property, where she would dispose of the body parts before coming back and getting more. Valentina's hips and legs were apparently too heavy to haul all the way down to the lake, so she took them to a nearby forest. Tamara's final trip sees her carrying a big silver pot, inside of which is Valentina's head, or at least whatever is left of it after Tamara was done eating most of it. 4 days later, on July 27th, a young couple that was living in the same apartment complex as Tamara and Valentina were out for a walk with their dog out near that lake. And as they're walking, their dog takes off running and stops in front of this huge bag that it's sniffing and pawing and trying to open. And the owners of the dog try to call it back, but they can't get it to get away from this bag. And so the owners walk over and they kind of poke the bag. They can see it's pretty heavy, and they open it up and they find a human torso, and it's Valentina's. When the police show up, the first thing they do is they go to Valentina's apartment, and they're surprised to find Tamara living there. And they're kind of sensitive with her, and they say, "Your friend, your relative was just found deceased, and we need to look around the apartment." Tamara was completely indifferent. She did not care. They had just discovered her body, and she didn't care that they were searching the apartment. It was like she knew someday this was going to happen. During the search, the police officers quickly find blood all over the bathroom and in the kitchen. They even find the hacksaw she used that's got blood on it, and they find Tamara's diary that's sitting next to this book about black magic. And the police are horrified when they see that the diary contains meticulous notes that Tamara had kept of all of the ritualistic killings she had perpetrated over the past 20 years. And there was 14 of them. And almost all of them were motivated by Tamara's desire to cast spells that she apparently was reading about in these black magic books she had. And virtually all of these spells required human flesh or other human components. And so she would kill these people, she would use their bodies to cast these spells, and then afterwards she would consume them. Not because that had anything to do with the spell, but because she liked the way people tasted, in particular human lungs. The police arrest Tamara, who doesn't put up a fight. She says, "Yep, you got the right person. I did all this." While Tamara was on trial, she seemed like she was in a great mood. She told the judge, "I hope you give me a really severe punishment. I expect to die in prison." She was seen blowing kisses to reporters. It was like she was just totally out of touch. Or maybe she literally knew this was going to happen and just didn't care anymore. Tamara, who would be nicknamed the Granny Ripper by newspapers over the course of this trial, was given a life sentence, and to this day, she is still sitting in jail. Here is the surveillance footage of Tamara disposing of Valentina's body, as well as some shots of Tamara during her trial. Or fitness instructor. She lived in Midlothian, Texas, and she taught a fitness boot camp out of a local church at least one day a week, every week. Missy was extremely bubbly and outgoing, and everybody seemed to really like her, and her personality really shined on social media, where she was an avid Facebook user, often posting multiple times a day, every day of the week. Missy would post information about upcoming fitness classes, either that she was teaching or that she was simply participating in. She would also post her own fitness regimen and her diet. She was just very focused on health. She also shared fairly personal things, like pictures of her family and where they were going and what they were up to. And she left her personal cell phone right on her Facebook page. So clearly, Missy was fine with kind of being out there. On April 17th, 2016, there was a weather report that came in that the next day there was going to be really, really heavy rain, in particular in the morning. And Missy's class was scheduled for the next morning at 5 a.m. and she started getting calls and text messages from the people who were going to that class asking, is this class still going to happen? By 7:55 p.m. that night, so many people had asked about it that she decided to just put a public post on her Facebook page addressing the weather. And it just said, if it's raining, we're still training, no excuses, you are gladiators. On the post, she included directions of how to get to the church, where this class was going to be in the church, what time they were starting, and what they could expect. Later that night at 9:23 p.m., she did another Facebook post that said, going to bed, I have to get up tomorrow at 3:30. The next day at 4:16 in the morning, a street security camera picked up Missy pulling into the church's parking lot. Even though her class didn't start until 5 a.m., she liked to get there early to make sure the classroom was set up and to warm up a little bit and make sure she was super motivated and cheerful as soon as they walked in. The security cameras inside the church capture Missy walking in through the front doors at 4:20 in the morning. Then, just before 5 a.m., the first couple of students arrived at the classroom and they walk in to find Missy laying on the ground, bleeding from her head, totally unresponsive. They call 911, police and paramedics show up, and as soon as they get there, they pronounce Missy dead. Initially, there was some speculation that she might have fallen and hit her head, but they noticed all these puncture marks in her head that looked intentionally inflicted, like someone had struck her. And later, when they reviewed the security footage from inside the church, it was confirmed that she definitely was murdered. Earlier that morning at 3:50 a.m., so 26 minutes before Missy arrives in the church parking lot, an unknown figure wearing police tactical gear from head to toe breaks into the church. From 3:50 in the morning when they first get inside the church to 4:20 in the morning when Missy walks through the front doors, this unknown figure just kind of strolls casually up and down the halls of this church. It looked like they were carrying a hammer or perhaps a crowbar, and periodically, as they're kind of casually walking down the hall, they would turn to a window of a door and they would break it with whatever they're holding in their hand, and then they would just keep walking on. Like there was no reason for them to break the window, they're just bored. And this was actually an important point that police would make about this footage. This person walking around does not appear to want to vandalize the church. I mean, they're breaking a couple windows, but they could have done a lot more damage to the building, and they didn't. They don't appear to be looking to steal anything, and in fact, later, police would confirm that nothing was stolen. What it looks like they're doing is just kind of wasting time, like they have some clear objective for being here, but they can't do it quite yet. They're waiting for a trigger of some kind. And it would turn out that that trigger was Missy walking through those doors at 4:20 in the morning. As soon as Missy made her way into the classroom, the assailant followed her and proceeded to beat her to death with whatever they were holding in their hand. By the time police arrived a little after 5 a.m., the suspect was long gone. Initially, police believed it was going to be fairly easy to identify who killed Missy. The person on camera wearing the tactical gear had a very distinctive gait with their feet turned out, and they walked with a bit of a limp, and they had very slouched posture. And the police figured as soon as we put this surveillance footage out in the public domain, someone's going to come forward and say they recognize this person. But despite the hundreds of leads that poured in from people after watching this video saying, "Oh yeah, I know this person," well, the police checked into all of them and they all checked out. Everybody had an alibi. And so years later, the police are still not able to identify who killed Missy or why, and so her case remains unsolved. Here is the security footage of Missy's killer casually walking around the halls, aimlessly smashing windows and opening doors, just waiting for Missy to show up. And then uploads that footage to his very popular This Is Dan Bell page that has over 500,000 subscribers. Unlike other urban exploration YouTube channels, Dan is not trying to create scary content. In fact, many of his most popular videos are taken in buildings that haven't even been abandoned yet, like in a Kmart that's shutting down and all the shelves are empty, and he walks around and it's kind of eerie because it's this huge store that's now coming to an end. But again, it's not really scary. But amongst those popular videos, there is one that is horrifying, and it's called the Super Creepy Abandoned Asylum. One of the top comments on this video is from a verified YouTube account with over 1 million subscribers. They're called The Proper People, and they say, "This may be the creepiest urban exploration video I have ever seen." The video opens with Dan coming up to this huge old house that looks like nature is reclaiming it with all the vines and grass and everything overgrown all around it. And for the first minute and a half, Dan is just quietly walking around the perimeter of this building, and you don't really know what it is, besides obviously the captions given away it's an asylum, but it doesn't look like an asylum. It looks like a random house in the middle of the woods. After about a minute and a half, Dan makes his way over to the side of this building, and he sees there are some stone steps that go down into a door that clearly feeds into the basement of this building. Dan walks down the stairs, he opens the door, and he walks into this hallway, and as soon as he goes in, because his camera had been filming in very bright sunshine outside, it takes a minute for it to focus on the hallway, which is totally dark. But once the camera focuses, you see all this old clothing strewn about on the ground, and the paint is peeling off the walls in every part of the building. When Dan filmed this, he was not out loud narrating as he walked around the building. Instead, while he was editing the footage, he must have recorded himself doing a narration, and that narration picks up as soon as he gets in the hallway and the camera has focused. He begins walking down this hallway, and you hear under his boots the crunch of broken glass. And as he's walking, you hear Dan's voice say, "This is a children's asylum that shut down sometime in the 1990s. It was briefly leased sometime in the 2000s, but for the most part, over the past 3 decades, this building has been totally abandoned." After he gives this brief history, which sounds like he's done this dozens of times on other videos, he pauses and says, "You know, Something really strange happened while I was filming inside of this building. He heard what sounded like someone running around on the top floor of this building. He's used to going into abandoned buildings and finding creatures, animals running around. That was not unusual. And so instinctively, he assumes it's got to be some animal that's taken up residence on the top floor. And so he doesn't worry about it. He ends up walking around the whole first floor before making his way upstairs. And he said when he got up there, he was expecting to see some animal or some sign of an animal living up there, but he didn't. He didn't see anything. It just looked like every other abandoned building. And after filming what he wanted to film, he eventually leaves the building and goes home. It wasn't until he loaded the footage onto his computer and began reviewing it that he noticed two specific instances while he was inside this asylum where clearly someone else is in the room with him. Dan speculates that perhaps a former patient has come back here and is living in one of the rooms upstairs. Here are the two segments from his video that show this kind of phantom person lurking in the shadows. In the first clip, keep your eyes on the door that is open leading downstairs. You'll see there is a shadow on the door that is being cast from whatever is standing at the top of the stairs just outside of our view. And at some point, as Dan is filming down the hall, that shadow vanishes down the stairs. In the second clip, when Dan walks into the room, look to the back left-hand side of the room at the door, specifically at the open hole where there should be a doorknob. You will see there is very clearly someone looking through the hole at Dan, and when Dan films this person, they run away. Monnier was a beautiful 25-year-old from a very wealthy, prominent family in Paris who desperately wanted to find a husband and move out of her mother's home and start her own life. The man she would fall in love with was not a young, rich aristocrat like her family was hoping, but instead was an older, poor lawyer. Her mother told her that she needed to break off this relationship and find a more suitable suitor. But Blanche refused and said she was in love with this man. When her mother outright forbid her from seeing this man ever again, she refused and began sneaking out at night to spend time with this guy and was away from the home quite a bit, just kind of escaping her mom. But during this tumultuous time where Blanche is very much at odds with her mother, Blanche would unexpectedly die. And since this is the late 1800s, people did that at a young age. They just unexpectedly died. And so her lover and her family and society mourned her loss, but ultimately time went on and people moved on. 25 years later, in 1901, French police received this strange handwritten letter that just basically states that the Monnier family has a very dirty secret and you should go check their estate out. Now, the Monnier family was in excellent standing in Paris. I mean, they were one of the more prominent families. The mother, she was known for her charitable works. They were just one of those families that everybody knew, including certainly the French police. And so when they got this letter, they weren't actually that concerned that there was any truth to this letter, but they felt like it was their duty to at least go knock on the Monnier family's door, show them the letter, and then just take a look around. And so they did that. They showed up. They showed the Monnier family, including her mother, who was at the door, hey, we have this letter. Would you mind if we looked around? The Monnier family was very cooperative. They let them walk around their whole big estate, and the police didn't find anything. As they're chatting in the doorway, getting ready to leave, because this is all just a big misunderstanding, one of the officers turns and looks up a little flight of stairs that they hadn't gone up and notices a small door that's been padlocked shut, and it's the only door at the end of this one stairwell. And he says off the cuff to the family, well, what's in that door up there? And Blanche's mother says, oh, that's a supply closet. You know, our assistants come in and they'll go in there and use that. And the French police officers say, well, would you mind if we just poked our heads in? It's the only space we haven't checked. And since we're already here, we'll just check that box. We'll go in there and poke our heads in. At this point, the Monnier family says, no, we're not going to let you go in there because you don't need to. It's just a supply closet. Now the police say, you're going to go ahead and open up that door. At which point the family says, No, we're not. So one of the officers tells the family to stay right here, while the other officer goes up the stairs to try to break open this lock and see what's in there. As soon as he's right outside the door, he's hit with this overwhelmingly disgusting smell. It smells like rotting flesh. It smells like death. He covers his mouth and he breaks open the lock and he opens the door, and there in the middle of this dark, disgusting smelling room on a rotting straw mattress is none other than Blanche Monnier. 25 years later, she is alive, she barely weighs 55 pounds, and she's chained to a bed. She has not come out of those chains or moved off of that bed in 25 years. The smell was so bad they could barely be in there for longer than a few minutes at a time, but one of the officers immediately goes over and knocks down some of the wood that was blocking up the windows, and sunlight pours into the room, and it's the first time Blanche Monnier is seeing sunlight in 25 years. The reason she had been imprisoned in this room is because 25 years earlier, when she was fighting with her mother about not seeing this poor commoner, and she wasn't willing to break off the relationship with him, her mother told her to go in this room and said, "You can't come out until you tell me you're going to break it off with this guy." She was so in love with him that she said no, and her mother wouldn't let her leave. And then days turned into months, turned into years, turned into decades, and here we are 25 years later, and she had never left that room. The mother and the brother of Blanche Monnier were arrested, and the public found out about this, and it incited a huge mob that went to their house. And it actually caused Blanche Monnier's mother to have a heart attack, and she would end up dying only a couple of days later. And so she never had to serve any jail time or really answer to any of her crimes. And the brother was complicit in what was happening to Blanche Monnier, but he kind of weaseled his way out of it. As for Blanche Monnier, she was remarkably lucid when she came out of that room, and she commented on how lovely it was to breathe fresh air and to be in sunlight. She was brought to a hospital where she did make a recovery, but she was so screwed up from being in that room that she didn't really know how to function in society anymore. And so she was moved to a mental institution, and unfortunately she died about 10 years. 1972, Uruguayan Flight 571 was flying from Uruguay to Chile for a rugby game. On board were 45 people. There was 5 pilots and crew. The other 40 were the rugby team and their friends and relatives. So they take off and they're making their way to Chile, and the pilot was relatively inexperienced, and he made a fatal mistake. He believed it was time to make their descent into Chile, but he was actually about 70 kilometers early. So as he's descending through the clouds, he believes he's going to see a runway and land this plane. Instead, he sees the Andes Mountains, and it's too late to pull up out of the way. He basically nicked the mountain, causing the plane to start tumbling down at breakneck speeds, 350 kilometers per hour. As it's tumbling down the mountain, the tail breaks off and 7 people are sucked out immediately that all perish. It's blazing down this mountain, and then it comes to a crashing stop where on impact it kills the 2 pilots. But miraculously, of the 45 people on board, 33 were still alive when all the dust settled. But that night, 5 more people would perish from the freezing temperatures, and within a couple days of this crash landing, another person would die. Those who were still alive that weren't in a coma or critically injured used luggage and debris from the plane and seats to create shelter, and they actually started pulling out lipstick from inside of some of the passengers' luggage, and they tried to write SOS on the outside of the plane because the fuselage was still pretty clearly intact, but they didn't have enough lipstick. They didn't have any medical supplies, and they didn't have proper clothing for the temperatures they were in. They did not anticipate being in minus 30 degrees Celsius temperatures for extended periods of time. They also had very, very little food, and it was running out very quickly. In a very cruel twist of fate, they actually found a working radio that allowed them to tune in and listen to the media as they tried to find them. And so they had to listen in horror after about a week when the search was called off, because no one knew where they were, and the assumption was they must have all died in the crash. When the food finally ran out, survivors began eating the seats inside the plane, the leather and the cotton. But as they're doing this, they know what the next step has to be if they're going to survive. They need to eat the dead. And so on day 9 of the ordeal, the survivors ate the pilots. And they chose the pilots because they were the only people amongst the dead that they didn't personally know. The rest of the dead that they would ultimately eat were their friends and loved ones. Now, naturally, these people did not want to become cannibals, but virtually everyone, out of a need to survive, was able to make the adjustment. There were some people that couldn't, including one woman who didn't eat and ultimately died of starvation on day 60 because she just was not prepared to do what was necessary to survive. As if this situation wasn't bad enough, an avalanche would eventually strike the landing site, killing 8 more of these people that are doing everything they can to survive. But at the time of the avalanche, their food source had effectively run out, and so those 8 people who perished in the avalanche ultimately replenished their food source. From day one, the survivors discussed climbing up and over the mountains and walking towards Chile to try to search for help. But the attempts so far had all failed due to extreme cold, malnutrition, altitude sickness. It was like they knew as soon as they walked over that mountain, they were going to die. And so many of them decided early on that they would rather just stay with the group because at least that way they would die as a group, or maybe by some stroke of luck they could still be discovered and they might be easier to discover as a big group. But 2 months after the crash, and with no help in sight, they know the search has been called off. 2 of the survivors basically say, screw it. I'm gonna make the trek over the Andes Mountains. We have no supplies, we have nothing, no map, no compass, no anything. We're just gonna walk roughly in the direction of Chile, and you know what? We're either gonna die here or we're gonna die out there. And so the 2 take off. They somehow survived for 9 days, walking over the Andes Mountains with no equipment. They've been out for 60 plus days at this point, and they managed to walk into this valley, and they see that there are people living in this valley. There's actually a couple of fishermen right on the other side of this river. And so they go down to the edge of the river and they're yelling out to these people on the other side. The fishermen couldn't make out what they were saying. And so the fishermen, they got a piece of paper and they put a pencil in it and balled it up with a rock and threw it across the river. And they were able to write down that they had survived a plane crash. They were located back in that direction. There was 14 other survivors and they desperately needed help. Balled it up, threw it back. 3 Chilean helicopters were spun up and sent off in their direction, and the 14 other survivors were able to be picked up, brought to safety, and all 16 would make a full physical recovery. However, the most difficult thing they would ever have to recover from was becoming reluctant cannibals, which is something that haunts all of them to this day. And here is the famous final picture of inside Uruguayan Flight 571 just moments before they crashed into the Andes Mountain and had to go through that horrific 72-day ordeal. Constantinescu was a 27-year-old woman living in the Romanian city of Timisoara. Loana was a devout practitioner of Zoroastrianism, which is one of the world's oldest organized religions that began in ancient Persia and is now practiced primarily in East Asia. In the city that Loana was living in, it was majority Christian, and they looked at Zoroastrians as witches. As such, Loana was persecuted and ostracized primarily by these 2 Christian ministers that spread a rumor that she was drinking the blood of local children and that she worshipped Satan. That rumor would spread and grow to the point where everybody knew Loana as like the singular witch of all the Zoroastrians in the city, and it ultimately incited this angry Christian mob to storm her house on October 21st, 1909, and rip her into the streets and savagely beat her to within an inch of her life. She would survive this lynching and she would be taken to a hospital where she'd be treated for severe blunt force injuries and lacerations. But after 2 days of being in the hospital, when she had not made a full recovery at all, she checked herself out and headed home. The next day, Loana was found dead in her apartment, and her family and friends initially believed that she had died as a result of the injuries she had sustained from the angry mob, and that perhaps she had checked herself out of the hospital too soon and untreated, that's why she must have passed away early. But when the authorities arrived at her house and began looking at the scene, it did not look like she had died as a result of those injuries. It looked more like some sort of ritual suicide. She was laying on this sofa with her arms over her chest. Next to the sofa was an altar that was adorned with strange occult symbols and ritual herbs and effigies. And on the altar was this goblet with deep, dark red stains on the inside. When they looked at Loana, even though she was fully dressed, underneath her sleeves were all these cuts on her arms, and there were cuts on her legs as well. After her autopsy, the medical examiner said she had died from a combination of blood loss and internal shock from ingesting massive quantities of blood that triggered cardiac arrest. Loana had been draining her own blood into the sacramental goblet, drinking it, and then doing it over and over again until she died. Locals believed that that was not just a ritual suicide, but rather she was placing a curse on her enemies. Almost immediately following her death, those two Christian ministers that had spread those rumors about her that led to the mob coming and attacking her, they both died of an extremely rare blood-borne illness. And then immediately following their demise, the two primary vigilantes that actually organized that mob that would attack Loana, they both died. One was hit by a falling tree and another died in a fire. And according to more recent accounts, Loana's curse didn't end with the death of her tormentors. There have been dozens of reports of people after seeing this image, which is of Loana after she was discovered by authorities in her home, that they will have bouts of extreme sleep paralysis. These are people that have never had sleep paralysis before, that this picture somehow induces sleep paralysis in them, like they're cursed by Loana. And so now that you've seen this image, you're cursed too. So